How's it going, guys? Bastians Goofy. Tonight, I want to tell you something special about Ice 9. Now, this is just a word to describe what's going to happen very soon with our economy. And when I mean the economy, I mean the entire world's economy, because it will collapse because of Ice 9.
Why is Bitcoin better than Visa unless you're a criminal? Now, if you're a criminal, I get it. If you're buying child pornography, you want to use the dark web and use some cryptos and all that. And if you try doing that with Visa, you'll probably get a call from the FBI. So I understand why it's good for criminals. But if you're not a criminal, if you're not a tax evader, if you're not buying child pornography, if you're not an arms dealer, if you're not a terrorist, then why is Bitcoin better than Visa? Anybody? Yes. Well, there's really no use case for it other than crime. And then it's not elastic. And this is important because there's a finite number of Bitcoins, 21 million Bitcoin. They're getting closer to that level every day. And everyone's like, this is a good thing because, you know, the problem with central banks is they print all this money and we're going to have inflation. By the way, we haven't had any inflation for the last 8 years. Separate issue. I'll come to that if we don't run out of time. But, you know, we hate central banks. They print too much money, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to cap the number of Bitcoin. But money supply has to be elastic. It can't be too elastic. The problem with central bank money is that it's too elastic. The reason, by the way, gold is such a good form of money is that it grows slowly. It grows at about the tempo of world growth. It grows at about the tempo of population growth. Not exactly, but close enough that it's the best form of money anyone's ever discovered. You hit a hard stop, which they will, and the economy keeps growing, but you want to back it with Bitcoin, so here's your money supply and here's your economy. That's inherently deflationary, right? Because each Bitcoin's got to support more and more growth, meaning your Bitcoin is worth more in theory, but the problem is you never get there. Why? Because if you have a deflationary currency, there's no bond market. The money supply grows based on credit, based on loans, based on various forms of borrowing. The money supply is just a foundation, and the economy grows with credit. Nobody wants to borrow in a form of money that's going to be more expensive when you pay it back. I'm not talking about interest. That's always part of the equation. But I'm saying the money itself is worth more when you have to pay back the loan. No one's going to borrow on that loan, therefore no bond market, therefore no viable form of money. So these are all the reasons why this is going to hit the wall.
In other places. It's happening in Greece right now. As you know, Greece has been navigating a massive debt crisis for years. In 2015, the IMF and their partners moved in to recapitalize Greece's banks. That just means they agreed to pump capital back into the stalled system, like priming a pump. In return, the IMF demanded control of the banks and citizens' individual accounts by default. Suddenly, Greek families weren't allowed to withdraw more than $460 per week. Imagine trying to pay your mortgage, gas, and groceries on less than $500, let alone your medical insurance. Of course, it led to widespread panic, rioting, and worse. And that's exactly what we'll see on a global scale when the next crisis hits.
Now, clearly, a national freeze can devastate the citizens big time. So my question is, why would the elites even want to do that?
Well, you're right, of course. This has been devastating to Greek citizens. But the short answer is control. To save itself from insolvency, Greece gave up its economic autonomy. The country is, for all intents and purposes, under the control of the European Central Bank and the IMF. Yet this top-down approach still hasn't solved the problem. As one Greek official told Reuters, the banks are in a deep freeze, but the economy is getting weaker. This is a microcosm of what we're about to see in America and around the world.
But still, I mean, really, aren't Greece and Cyprus fairly isolated examples?
Unfortunately, if you think governments tend to keep their hands off citizens' assets, you're mistaken. Elites have a long history of seizing control of people, institutions, and especially money. In February of 1917, for example, the Russian elite, who believed in a one-world workers' party, closed the stock market. Folks lost every penny. Their portfolios literally vanished overnight. The Russian exchanges remained closed for nearly 70 years. They reopened in January of 1992. In December of 1941, China closed its stock market without warning. It stayed closed for 4 years. The German government closed the stock market from July 1931 to April 1932 during a credit crisis. The list of examples goes on, and it goes back decades.
But again, I have to ask you, could such a systematic freeze really happen here in the United States?
It already has happened, John, multiple times, just on a smaller scale. In 1914, the Treasury Department shuttered the New York Stock Exchange for 4 months. Citizens couldn't buy or sell. They couldn't cash out. They couldn't do anything. England's elites did the same thing to the London Stock Exchange. But we've seen more recent examples too. If you want to see what a modern-day Ice 9 freeze looks like, take a look at this image. Those blue dots represent trades on the New York Stock Exchange on July 8, 2015. You can see where they abruptly stop. That was the moment the elites running the exchange pulled the plug. You weren't allowed to buy or sell a single share, period. But I want people to take a closer look at this chart. Now imagine it represents all the banking and brokerage activity on Earth. You see that point around 11:33 a.m. when you had the first big drop-off in activity? That represents the beginning of the coming Ice 9 cash freezes. Now you see when all the activity stops and the screen goes totally white? All activity ceases. The system goes dark. The pattern is the same with these freezes every time. You have some initial trigger or shock, then you have an immediate freeze, and the elites emerge with more control. You see it over and over. Shock, freeze, power grab. Shock, freeze, power grab. With Ice 9, we'll see a global shock and a global freeze, and then we'll see the elites making a global power grab. Here's another example, again with the New York Stock Exchange. On October 27, 1997, the Dow had lost 350 points quickly. Again, the elites responded by shuttering the entire New York Stock Exchange instantaneously. Imagine if you had been trying to sell. Your money would have been locked into the system and your net worth would have been plummeting by the second. Meanwhile, you're just watching it happen, totally powerless to do anything about it. What we're seeing right now is an increase becoming faster and faster. You had 9/11 followed by a freeze. We had the flash crash of 2010 followed by a freeze. And in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy.
But you're talking about American stock markets. I mean, if the elites do freeze our exchanges and brokerage accounts, won't our cash be safe in the banks?
No. In fact, the biggest bank freeze to date happened right here in the USA. Of course, I'm talking about Roosevelt signing Proclamation 2039 in 1933. With one stroke of his pen, FDR shuttered every bank in America. A few weeks later, he followed up by freezing the entire gold market. Executive Order 6102 literally outlawed citizens from owning gold. That freeze lasted 41 years until Gerald Ford ended that freeze in 1974. When the coming crisis hits, we'll see this repeated on a larger scale through the IMF, World Bank, and the Fed. Again, there will be nothing the White House can do. They have no direct control over the institutions that will carry this out. Not even the U.S. president can control the Fed. Same with the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, or the People's Bank of China. When the crisis hits, it will likely be bad enough that Trump would get on board anyway. But it won't be enough to save his presidency. Even if he survives his first term, he won't get a second one.
But we really haven't addressed one important factor here. Now, you say the elites will need an excuse to impose Ice 9 on America, and that excuse will come in the form of a massive financial crisis, much worse than 2008. And you say that this crisis could come within the next 6 weeks. Regardless of the actual day it hits, you say the coming crisis is unavoidable. So please explain to our viewers what you mean by that exactly.
In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, the Pentagon recruited me for another special project. Our goal was to create a new system for modeling and predicting systemic financial collapse. I received an invitation to a classified meeting at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. This meeting occurred on April 8, 2009. In attendance were several of our country's leading physicists and national security experts. We met at Los Alamos for an important reason. The lab there houses the most powerful modeling systems on the planet. They're running predictive modeling simulations on everything from weather events to nuclear chain reactions. Los Alamos National Laboratory takes a system-based approach to predictive modeling. Their computers don't look at events in isolation. They look at the whole system, how the events interact with each other. It's a relatively new branch of physics called complexity theory. You can look at the approach in a number of different ways. It's like seeing the forest for the trees. It's like understanding all the dominoes in a chain reaction. Let me give you an example of this approach. Let's say you have 10 dominoes lined up on a table, and you have 2 observers. One observer, Joe, sees all 10 dominoes from the beginning of the experiment. The second observer, Sally, can only see 1 domino, the 7th in the series. Looking at domino number 7, Sally can still make plenty of observations. It appears stable, for example. It also appears just as likely to fall in one direction as the other. She can study it for years, and she can assume it will never fall. On the other hand, Joe sees all 10 dominoes, including number 7. So one day a force comes along and tips domino number 1 into domino number 2. At that moment, Joe can tell you with near 100% certainty that domino 7 is about to fall. Sally, on the other hand, continues along blissfully unaware, yet with total expertise when it comes to domino number 7. She just can't see how it fits into the system of dominoes, and she can't see the inevitable event coming. When domino 7 falls, Sally is caught almost completely unaware. Well, in essence, Sally represents the mainstream economists and media pundits. Joe represents the approach we developed at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And I've since refined all 3 meetings convinced of one thing. When the next crisis hits, the elites are planning to freeze the financial system, and they'll replace it with a new system, one not based on the U.S. dollar. When that happens, we'll wake up to a very strange and disturbing new reality.
And for our viewers that are watching today, what might their reality look like that morning? How does this manifest?
First, they'll have gone to bed knowing that a massive financial crisis was underway. But when they wake up, they'll find it has worsened and the contagion has spread worldwide. When they go to withdraw money, their ATM will say, closed temporarily. When they go to sell stocks, their account will say, transaction not available. When they go to their local business, that business will only accept cash if it's open. As citizens realize they're being barred from their money, riots will erupt. It's going to get really bad really quickly.
How would such a freeze actually work? And wouldn't that be highly illegal?
Well, it wouldn't be illegal technically because they've been quietly laying the groundwork for years. They've rigged the financial laws, changed the rules of the game to allow this to happen. The stage is set. They have the levers in place. The lights are positioned. Now someone just needs to flick a switch and they'll impose ICE 9 rapidly. And again, all of this will be legal because they've rigged the system in their favor. Here in the U.S., for example, Congress pushed through something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This allows the government to freeze accounts, assets, even whole institutions at will. The only condition is that there's some threat to national security with a foreign connection. Of course, with a global market, every financial crisis has a foreign connection. Any systemic crisis fits the bill. And the thing is, when the next crisis hits, it's going to be so bad, President Trump won't have any choice but to go along with the elite's plan.
Wow. That is, you have to admit, that sounds somewhat hard to believe. Now, how could these operatives actually freeze?
Well, fortunately, we have some recent real-life examples to study. The elites have been conducting a series of dry runs for years, leading up to ICE 9. Look at Cyprus, for example. A few years ago, the Cypriot economy was in trouble, especially the banks. The IMF stepped in and loaned Cyprus $10 billion, but the loan came with strings. Now pay attention because this is precisely what they're going to do. But imagine it on a global scale. So in exchange for the capital injection, the IMF demanded control over the Cypriot banking system. More specifically, the IMF froze the entire system, literally every bank in the country. And they did that to ensure the IMF's demands were met, including strict capital controls. So how did all this impact regular citizens? Their local ATMs went dark. Even the bank branches closed, permanently in some cases. Citizens could not withdraw cash. They couldn't even transfer funds from one account to the other. What came next? Wealth extraction on a grand scale. The IMF basically stole 6 to 10% of all the cash in the Cypriot bank accounts. How did the elites justify this? They called it a levy, the price regular citizens had to pay for their government's missteps. Keep in mind, these asset confiscations were done at the balance sheet level with the institutions themselves. They never had to confiscate individual accounts. They froze every account by controlling a handful of the country's biggest banks. When the next crisis hits, we're going to see this here in the U.S. and around the world. And it'll be a highly coordinated global attack on the entire system simultaneously.
All right, but hold on here. Wasn't Cyprus a fairly isolated example of the globalist elites taking over a nation's banking system?
Not even close, John. The same thing has happened in other places. It's happening stage and replacing the dollar for major transactions between banks, businesses, and billionaires. The IMF has already started issuing SDR-denominated bonds through the World Bank. And when the next crisis hits, they'll refloat the world financial system in exactly this way, by issuing mountains of SDRs to governments and international institutions worldwide. The dollar will get left out of the new equation, and Americans will wake up to a new post-dollar reality just 48 hours later. Here's the final twist. They won't be issuing any of these SDRs to individual Americans. We'll be left with dollars, which will become like our version of the Mexican peso.
Why are the elites so anxious to bring about one world money? I mean, what's the end game?
The end game is control and wealth extraction. If you have one world money, you can have one world central bank, the IMF. Once you have one world money and one world order, all overseen by the elites, they can begin wealth extraction on a grand scale. I'm not just talking about taxation, although a world taxation plan is in the works for after ICE 9. I'm talking about all kinds of confiscation of assets. They'll come after every penny they can through taxation, penalties, regulatory schemes, bank levies, trumped up criminal prosecutions, and good old fashioned thievery, in the end, we'll see the rise of neo fascism around the world, along with a massive redistribution of wealth. The elites will come out the big winners. Everyone else, including the middle class, will come out devastated.
You write in your new book, The Road to Ruin, once capital is frozen, capitalism itself is gone. Are you saying that the coming crisis will lead to the death of capitalism itself?
Yes, I'm saying that we won't recover from the next crisis. We're about to go through a one-way door. There is no turning back. This won't be about fixing the capitalist system. It will be about replacing it. All we're waiting for now is the big